All right, how you guys doing? Doing good? All right, yeah, it is kind of few, but this feels like a kind of a feisty bunch. I like it. Charlie, yeah, throw me that. There it goes. That'll work. There we go. Thank you. All the things. If well, you know what I want to start by just thanking Rob for his leadership. And again, if you don't mind, would you just again? I mean, it's could sometimes be a thankless job, but thank you very much. And I also want to say thank you. Thank you for your hospitality and kind of welcoming Sue and I in as kind of like family. And it's been fun to be here the last couple of days. If you remember, we started yesterday. I asked the question, "What's the dream?" You remember that? And what's the dream? And I'll tell you, I'm going to pull out that whiteboard again. I think this might help us. And I just kind of reflect a little bit too on when we were first, the 4 college students. We were thinking about planting a church. And we asked the question, what's the dream? I'm going to go back to kind of my story, but I really want you to be thinking about your own story. We did say this. We said, phase 1, we would love for it to be, remember this? An impact church. And if God would kind of bless that, then we would love for then secondly to be a reproducing church. And not just one church, but we figured, if one church plant was the way to help more and more people find and follow Jesus, then why wouldn't we want to plant a church that would plant a church that would plant a church? So we began to think in terms of a reproducing church. And then 3, we said, you know what, if God would bless this thing, and coming from a similar background as many of you, we saw the church as a movement. Acts 1:8, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, ends of the earth. Could you really do that through us, Lord? And so this was kind of both our vision, but also kind of our prayer. To be an impact church, to be a reproducing church, and then if God would bless it, catalyze a movement out of it. One of the things that happened along the way, and if you, I hope you got one of these handouts when you came in. This will be kind of helpful to you. One of the things that happened over the last several years that's been super helpful for us in thinking through this has been the work of Exponential. And Charlie Burke is here. Charlie's up front. If you're curious about Exponential Australia and anything that I've been talking about appeals to you, I'd really encourage you to follow up with Exponential Australia. Rob's on our board and has been a great contributor to that. But one of the things that we began to discover through Exponential is that basically churches have, there's 5 different levels of churches. And you'll notice that in your handout. There's what we call level 1 church. A level 1 church is a church that's in decline. Okay, a church is in decline. You have less people showing up this year than last year. The church is in decline. Then you have what we call level 2 churches. Level 2 churches are those that have plateaued. You added a few folks, lost a few folks, but you're kind of at a steady state. Level 2. So level 1, decline. Level 2, plateau. Then we said there were level 3 churches. Level 3 churches are those churches that are growing churches. You've added a few people, and you're starting to see this upward trend, okay, and advancing the mission of Jesus, growing churches. Now, here's what's happened really over the last at least probably 50 years in Western Christianity. In Western Christianity, I would say that most churches think those are our 3 options. Those are our 3 options, that either we're a declining church, a plateauing church, or a growing church. And the best that we can do is to grow my church. I want you to hear why I said that, right? The best I can do is grow my church. And one of the things I love about the work of Exponential, and again, I'd encourage you to check out what we're doing through Exponential Australia, is that they begin to show to us, both through research but also in Scripture, there really is such thing as what we call a level 4 church. And a level 4 church is a reproducing church. Is a church that's ever planted another church. A church that ever started another site. A church that ever began to reproduce. A reproducing church. But even beyond that then, they begin to talk to us about what we call a level 5 church. And a level 5 church would be a multiplying church. A church that really does take on this idea of Acts 1:8, goes from Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, into the earth. That's bought into kind of this apostolic vision that Paul had that he expressed to Timothy. He said, hey, Timothy, these things I've entrusted to you, we're going to teach to others who will teach to others also. And so this multiplying church thinks in terms of 4 generations of multiplication. Are you tracking with me? Give me a little nod if you're with me on that. So they plant a church that plants a church that plants a church that plants a church. And so particularly for us, as 4 kind of young people right out of college who had, where our imagination, our missional imagination was wild, this is dramatically appealing. Because what we were really talking about, if you think about it, an impact is almost like kind of level 3. That's good. But reproducing is like level 4. That's even great. But like movement making or multiplying is level 5, and that's even greater. And so we began to pursue that. And so what I want to talk to you about today, in the remainder of our time, we got the first half of it yesterday, is what does it look like for you to be a multiplier? What does it look like for you to be a multiplier? Turn to someone near you and go like, I wonder what it means to be a multiplier. Go ahead and just do that. Help me out. Come on. I wonder what it means to be a multiplier. There we go. I'm glad you asked. Here's a multiplier, okay? A multiplier is this. Here's the definition we're going to use. And you can go ahead and fill in the blank there on your handout. A multiplier is a healthy, that's really important. We hit that pretty hard last night, didn't we? A healthy disciple-making leader that champions reproduction. If any of you, and I would encourage you, yes, you know what? For you to ask the question, how do I grow my church? That's a good thing. But it is not a great or a greater thing. And when I read John 14:12, Jesus came to his disciples and said, listen, you know what? The things you've seen me do, you're going to do those things. Oh, no. And then he goes even farther than that. He goes, you're going to do even, help me out. What does he say? What? Come on. You're going to do even greater things, right? Greater things. And I think that's what we're talking about. I think it's part of what we're talking about here. And I think it gets manifest when each of us decide to be a multiplier, a healthy disciple-making leader who champions reproduction. So last night, what we talked about, let's see if we can get up here. Am I pointing this the right way? It's not on, you're right. That would help. So somebody in the back must have been doing, thank you very much for that. There we go. Okay. Oh. Which way? I'm stumped. The multiple, it has both an internal world and an external world. And what we did last night was we talked exclusively about the internal world. And we have to have an awareness that as we multiply, we're going to reproduce who we are. We're going to reproduce who we are. That's why it's so important that we're continually monitoring those 4 gauges of how am I doing relationally, how am I doing physically, how am I doing mentally, and how am I doing spiritually. And that's why I gave you that RPMs tool. It's a tool. I got up this morning in my journal. I wrote those 4 letters, RPMS. I gave myself a score. I asked myself, am I drifting in any of those areas? Am I drifting relationally, physically, mentally, or spiritually? Because I do not want to end up someplace I never intended to be. So important. Because, we've seen that happen over and over again. Aren't we tired of reading that? Find about Christian leaders who end up someplace they never intended to be. So it starts with this internal world. Thank you very much. But then after that, then we go to the external world. Okay, the external world. Let me start with kind of a story. I was in a setting kind of like this. There was a guy named Neil Cole that was actually teaching the workshop. Maybe some of you know the name Neil Cole. Maybe some of you have even read his books. I was sitting in a workshop like this, and I remember Neil kind of asked that question, same question I led with. He said, what's the dream? What's the dream? Now, at that point in time, even though I had written this down, okay, on the back of a napkin, as I'm sitting out there like you, I was thinking to myself, you know what? I'm a young church planter. We just gotten started. I'm going, if my church could be 1,000 people, that's my dream. If my church could be 1,000 people, that's my dream. You hear I'm saying that? What am I saying? Right. So that's how I'm thinking. Then Neil does this. He said, here's what I want you to do. I want you to take your dream and multiply it times 1 million. 1 million. So I started to do the math. 1,000 times 1 million. Help me out, somebody. 1,000 times 1 million's a billion. You're exactly right. Very good. 1 billion. And then Neil said this. He said, okay, what I want you to do is I want you to figure out how to make that dream happen. Here's what happened. It kind of, something just totally shifted in my mind. Because when I said I want my church to be 1,000 people, here's what I was thinking. I was thinking, you know what, maybe I'd be gifted enough that I could communicate so that 1,000 people would show up every weekend, every Sunday in services, right? Or maybe I could administrate well enough, because 1,000 people, that'd probably be 100 small groups, 10 people each. Maybe I could administrate well enough to have 1,000 people. I could do that. But all of a sudden, when he shifted that thing, he said, I want you to multiply it times 1 million. And I went to 1 billion, and then said, how do you do that? I knew in that moment, I couldn't communicate well enough to attract 1 billion people. I couldn't organize well enough to put 1 billion people in small groups. In fact, okay, so if that was even conceivable or possible at all, what was going to have to happen? It was going to have to happen. I mean, I was going to have to partner with a lot of other people. I was going to have to develop a lot of leaders. But overall, basically, it came down to this one thing. What I was going to have to do is over and over again, I was going to have to not only make disciples, but I was going to have to make disciple makers. Because if I could make disciple makers, then they would keep doing the same thing over and over and over and over again for years. And then maybe, just maybe, you'd have a shot at this crazy dream. And I said this the other day, and I hope this stuck with you. I want to challenge you that you need to have a dream so big that it makes you dependent on God. And if you have a dream like me, back then it said, oh, what if my church could be 1,000 people? And you'd figure out kind of how you can do it. You need to get a bigger dream. And there's something about having a really big dream. I'm telling you, there's something about having a really big dream that pushes you to a dependency on God like nothing else will. And so if you're buying into this idea of a multiplier, the first thing you have to do is you have to make disciple makers. You have to make disciple makers. If we got to spend any time together at all, you would understand that what I believe is I have found that I think what the church has to do, we have to reproduce at every level. We need to reproduce, yes, making disciple makers, but we also need to reproduce leaders. We also need to reproduce groups. We need to reproduce churches. We also need to think in terms of even networks. I mean, I would love to have a conversation with your whole movement about how could you, for those that are willing, get into networks and to begin to think about how do we plant churches together, and then how do we reproduce those networks. I was just in Kampala, Uganda, and they get this first one of making disciple makers. There's a church there that we've had the privilege of working with. 5 years ago, they'd planted about 8 churches. Now they've planted 121. And here's what happens. You don't just suddenly plant 121 churches. What they get is that it starts with making disciple makers. And in fact, if you were to go to Worship Harvest Church there in Kampala, Uganda, you'd see speckled all across the auditorium people who are wearing T-shirts that says, who's your 12? Just like Jesus, who's your 12? Who are the 12 people that you're actually discipling? And I would challenge you. Let me ask you, who are you discipling? We can't skip this part. And candidly, I think most of the Western church is coming to a reckoning that what's happened pre-COVID was that we did not do a good job of making disciples. And if we're going to do a good job of disciples, it means people like me, people like you, actually being able to name the people that we're discipling. If I had to name those people, right? Sue and I are in a Tuesday night small group. And the people I would name, I'd say Rick and Linda, Alan and Colleen, Doug and Mary, Eddie and Kristen. There's people that I would name that I'm trying to convene with regularly. And yes, sometimes it's very challenging. Sometimes you feel like you're not making progress. But those are the people that we're trying to disciple. So here's what I would love for you to do. And if you notice in your handout, you had a place there to kind of evaluate how you're doing on the RPMs, relational, physical, mental, spiritual. What I'd love for you to do is also kind of evaluate how are you doing on that first one right there of making disciple makers. How are you doing on that? Who are the disciples that you're making? And here, and in particular, because I'm talking to a group of leaders here, I want to challenge you to think in terms of making disciples on two different extremes, two different ends of the spectrum. Take this in. I think this will be helpful to you. I think you need to make disciples at the smallest kind of level of your leadership influence, and then you also need to make disciples at the largest level of your leadership influence. Let me kind of unpack that a little more. At the smallest level and also at the largest level. When I talk about at the smallest level over here, I mentioned, for example, Sue and I are in a small group on Tuesday nights, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in this next kind of 4 practices. We have a fairly large church that has multiple locations across Chicago, and you've heard the other things that we're up to. But I think it's really, really important, no matter how big my ministry gets, that I am in a small group making disciples. It's good for me. I need to be in a small group. Number one, I'm just a person, right? We all need that community. But the second thing is, here's what happens. As a leader, you are a culture creator. You know what I'm talking about? You're a culture creator. Now, will your church survive without you leading a small group? Yeah, they probably would. But here's the important reason for you to lead a small group. One, you need it, but second, because you create culture. Because see, when you're in a small group and you're making disciples in that way, or a missional community, whatever you call it, what you're saying is, this is how we do it around here. Everybody makes disciples, including the lead pastor, including the senior leadership. You're creating that kind of a culture. Everybody does it around here. So I think you need to do it at the smallest level, but then you skip other things in between, and then you do it at the largest level. So if you're a local church pastor, let's say you're a local church pastor, and you have a church of, we'll say, 120 people. I would say you lead a small group and say, this is how we make disciples. You're creating culture there. You skip everything in between. There may be other leaders. There may be volunteer coaches. There may even be a staff. You skip all those things. Let them take responsibility for all of those things. And to the largest level, then you go like, oh, I'm going to have someone alongside me that I'm discipling who's going to be the next pastor, the next church planter. Sometimes we call it a leadership resident or a church planting apprentice. If you're serious about being a multiplier, you do it at the smallest level to create culture, then you do it at the largest level to create more capacity for the kingdom. Culture and capacity. Give me a little nod if you're with me on that, okay? And that's part of how you become a multiplier. So the first practice, okay, now we're in your external world. The first practice is making disciple makers. And the second one then is what we're going to talk about is establishing spiritual communities. Establishing spiritual communities. And again, there's different names we have for these in different churches, different settings, different contexts. You might call them small groups. You might call them missional communities. You might call them LTG groups, life groups, maybe some other name. Whatever you call them, I think this is fundamentally true. Relationships are the catalyst for spiritual growth. Relationships are the catalyst for spiritual growth. And again, that's why Sue and I are in a Tuesday night small group. We need to do life together. I'm going to be a disciple maker, but the context in which disciple making always happens is the context of relationships. In the book I had the opportunity to write with Warren Bird, it's called Hero Maker. We actually got to do some of the research. Actually, Warren did this. He took the Gospels and basically looked at them as all the different events in the life of Jesus. All the different events in the life of Jesus. And as he looked at all the different events in the life of Jesus, he was able to break it down into 2 categories. Time that Jesus spent with the many and time that Jesus spent with the few. How much time did he spend with the crowds? And how much time did he spend with the disciples? You tracking? And he began to look at that, and what he discovered is, just based on the events in the Bible, that Jesus spent 27% of his time with the crowds and 73% of his time with his disciples. Almost 3-to-1. 3-to-1 with the few versus the many. Now, I want you to think about, how do you allocate your time? Think about how you allocate your time. I think a lot of us, as pastors, as leaders, what we do, we end up spending most of our time getting ready for the large group, getting ready for and being a part of, the Sunday morning gathering, and it's not the few. What if you began to look at your calendar and say, you know what, I want my calendar to match Jesus. That I'm going to spend 73% of my time making disciple makers and establishing spiritual communities, and only 27% of the time thinking about Sunday morning and worrying about the crowd. I wonder if that's the thing that allows us to be multipliers, that allows us to be a reproducing church, to be a multiplying church, to actually catalyze a movement like Acts 1:8, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, ends of the earth. It's interesting, there's a little verse in John chapter 3, verse 22, and it says that Jesus spent some time with them. Okay, and you've probably read it 1,000 times, and maybe never even paused to look at it, but Jesus spent some time with them. It's talking about Jesus with the disciples. And if you look at that, there's a Greek word there, spent some time with them, and the Greek word is diatribo. Say that after me, diatribo. All right, you're gonna be smarter. You go home, I learned a Greek word today. And diatribo actually is a composite of two words. It means to rub up against, or like to rub off. And it literally means that Jesus spent some time rubbing off on them. I'll tell you what, do me a favor. Yeah, that's it. Go ahead. Do me a favor and find somebody next to you and just rub on them a little bit. Go ahead and do that. Go ahead. There you go. That's it. There it is. That's right. That's it. That's what Jesus, he just spent some time rubbing off on them. You got to be close. You got to be hanging out with one another. It's funny. I've taught this a lot of different places around the world. And when I was teaching this in the UK to a bunch of English folks, right? And I got to the diatribo, and I was like, they rub off on each other. Hey, lean over next to you, someone, and just rub off on them. And they all look at me like this. They don't even move. It was fun. There was 2 days later, we'd flown to Spain. We were in Madrid, Spanish-speaking folks. And I'm going like, yeah, John 3:22, diatribo. Jesus spent some time rubbing off on them. Hey, lean over and rub off on somebody. I mean, and they're like all over each other, just the, the cultural difference. So funny. But I hope you get that takeaway, okay? Here's what Jesus did, right? Just 73% of his time is just rubbing off, hoping a little bit of Jesus rubbed off on his disciples. And I think that's what we have to do. That's how we have to do. That's how we have to allocate our time. So this whole idea of a multiplier, yeah, you got this internal world because you want to reproduce who you are working, but now we're getting this flywheel, okay, the flywheel, the external world. And it's hard at first. It's hard making disciples. Just because we might be able to explain this easily does not mean that it's easy to do. This is hard work. I want to make it accessible, but it's still hard. So it's hard. But this flywheel of getting multiplying and reproducing and creating movement, yeah, it's hard work. And so you make disciple makers. You establish these spiritual communities. I'll tell you, go ahead and give yourself, take a look at that assessment there. How are you doing with that? Establishing spiritual communities. Ask yourself this: what part of a spiritual community am I currently a part of? Am I a part of a small group? Am I a part of a missional community? Am I a part of a pastoral network? Ask yourself that. Because once you get this flywheel starting to crank, okay, I'm making disciple makers, I'm establishing these spiritual communities, and I've done this a few rotations. Like a flywheel, it's hard at first, but you start to get a little momentum, okay? And it starts to get a little more faster and faster, and you start to feel it move on its own. Then comes the third piece. Mobilize leaders. Mobilize leaders. When we talk about mobilizing leaders, I would think in terms of two things. It often starts with, and I think Sue taught on this for those of you that were in her workshop, with what we call an I see in you conversation. An I see in you conversation. And this mobilizing leader ends with commissioning people and sending them out. With commissioning them and sending them out. Kind of like what we saw last night, right? That's the other end of mobilizing leaders. Now, when we talk about the beginning part, I see in you, those are the four most important letters in a leader's alphabet. I see in you. And what you do is all of a sudden those people that are sitting in your chairs, the people that are sitting in your pews, They're not just there so you can count them as an attendance number, but those are people that you're going like, no, those are people who need to be discipled. Those are people who need to be in spiritual communities. Those are potential leaders that need to be mobilized. And so you're looking at those folks, and you're trying to see what is the good gift that God gave to them. What's the good gift that God prepared? Ephesians 2:10, there's a good gift that God prepared in advance for everyone to do. What is that good thing? And when you see it in them, you say, I see in you. And then you tell them. You tell them. And I'm telling you, that is life-changing. My hunch, I won't ask for a show of hands, but my hunch is the vast majority of you are in this room this afternoon as a leader in a church because somebody along the way saw something in you that you didn't see in yourself. And they said it out loud. Enough of you are going like, that's true, right? They saw it. Why aren't we doing it with other people? And it is so powerful because of the influence you have already in those folks' lives. I remember I was in middle school camp. I was in middle school. It was actually a church summer camp. And one of the guys at our camp was a guy by the name of Dennis Gamoff. Now, Dennis Gamoff was one of the kind of camp counselors, but Dennis Gamoff had been a high school basketball All-American. Not only was he a high school basketball All-American, but later on he went and played in college in the Big Ten Conference. I mean, for me as a little dude, right, think about me, 12 or 13 years of age, Dennis Gamoff is at my camp. And I mean, he was like awesome at everything. I was like awestruck by Dennis Gamoff. We were playing softball, and even though basketball is his sport, I mean, he was awesome at softball, right? We just finished playing softball. I'm leaving the softball field. I'm walking back towards kind of the canteen or something over this hill, and I'm walking back, and all of a sudden I feel this hand on my shoulder. Big hand, and I turn around, and guess who's there? Dennis Gamoff, that's right. You're starting to understand how big a deal this guy was. There was Dennis Gamoff. And Dennis says this to me. He said, hey, Dave, I've been watching you this week. I see in you somebody who I think could be a really good leader. 12 or 13, that's a long time ago. But that still sticks with me. That still sticks with me. If you got to be in Sue's workshop, you heard my wife Sue talk about when she first did student teaching. When she first did student teaching, I don't know, was it a semester even? It was a semester. Her teacher, who she was under, was Marianne Mellema. And Sue will tell you that Marianne Mellema, after she taught, found her afterwards and said, oh, Sue, you as a teacher, you're a natural. You're a natural. And that was that I see in you conversation that changed everything. That for Sue, it's like, oh, I could be a teacher. I could make a difference in kids' lives. I'm telling you, okay, if we're going to mobilize leader, you got to, don't waste your influence by not saying those things out loud. I see in you. And then after you have the I see in you conversation, yeah, you disciple them just like you would anybody else. But at the end, just like you saw last night, they are not, please hear me in this, they are not your perpetual assistant. They are not just there to be your right-hand person. They're not there just to be your co-leader and kind of pick up whenever you can't be around. No, you're training them, mobilizing them, just like we did last night. You're basically, it's kind of like ordination. You commission them and you send them out. Because there's something really important that God meant for them to do. And then you start the whole process all over again. Then you start the process all over again. It's so important. I think about Troy McMahon. Troy's one of my favorite examples. Troy's a guy who was actually someone I discipled as an apprentice leader in a small group. He took over that small group, reproduced another leader, started coaching groups, saw those groups reproduced. Eventually, when we decided to go to multiple locations, rather than go to a Bible college or a seminary, Troy had this track record of proven faithfulness. And I asked him, he was working for General Mills. I said, would you quit working for General Mills and come to work for the church? And I asked him, would you raise your own salary? And he said yes to both. He quit his job, raised his own salary, and actually joined our church staff and helped us to go to multiple locations. It was about 10 years later that he came to me, and he actually started a couple different locations for us. Did a brilliant job. Came and said, hey, you know what? I think I'm supposed to go plant a church. And honestly, there was a part of me then I was kind of like, I mean, he's like one of our best friends. I hated to see him do it. I said, where are you thinking? And he said, I think back in Kansas City. And so when he said Kansas City, I knew it just made sense. I mean, he grew up around there. He played college football at Kansas State University. He just fit that context. So him and his wife Janet moved to Kansas City, along with about 20 other people, and they started that church. And that church, it got to 3 different locations. They actually started 3 different church planting networks, and they've now planted 60 churches in the last 15 years. See, this idea here, I mean, it's good. Healthy things grow. I want your churches to grow. But don't settle for that. Don't settle for that. I'm talking about being a reproducing and multiplying church. And if you're going to do that, that means you have to mobilize leaders. And I remember having the IC&U conversation with Troy several different times. But then also, when he was ready to leave, he was not there just to be my campus pastor. Did you hear me on that? He is not there I don't own him, okay? We have a kingdom, we do not have castles, right? We have a kingdom, we do not have castles. And so we commission and we send him out. And you know what? I am so grateful for what he's doing in Kansas City and that I got to be a small part of that. And that's what it takes to be a level 4, level 5 kind of church. That's what it takes to get to reproducing or even to movement. You've got to mobilize these leaders over and over and over again. And again, I thought last night, you should just do me a favor, pat somebody in the back, okay? Go ahead and pat somebody in the back. What you saw last night, I mean, there were 17 folks come up here, right? And you're saying, you know what? We've invested in them, now we're sending them out. But I think your expectation also ought to be, of those 17, they're going to do the same. And so, like, maybe next year we're up here, we're going, hey, we got 20. The year after that, you got 25. The year after that, all of a sudden, you got this flywheel. You see how it works? The flywheel begins to crank. And it's hard. It is hard. But you begin to get momentum. And so, you're making disciple makers, right? Then you're establishing spiritual communities. You're mobilizing these leaders by having IC&U conversations, commissioning and send them out. But then the next thing is you start launching church expressions. I love what I'm already seeing in here in the Church of Christ. When Rob kind of gave us the update in his vision time, there were so many different expressions of the church. Am I right? Let's just applaud that right there. That is good news. And you need to keep thinking that way. Keep using your missional imagination. And somebody's going to come up with some idea. You know what? Here's what's going to happen. Somebody's going to go, hey, you know what? Could we start a church in the metaverse? And some of you are going to go like, I don't know if that really counts. No, just let them give it a shot. Let them give it a shot. We need a micro, we need a macro, and we need a meta. We need all kinds of expressions of church. All kinds of expressions. We have to constantly be doing that. At Community, one of the things that really for us, that's the church I lead in Chicago, post-COVID, we went from being what we called one church with multiple locations to one church with multiple expressions. And we began to say we have 4 different expressions. We have our locations across the city and suburbs of Chicago, the physical locations, but we also have community freedom. We have 2 churches in prisons in the Chicago area. We also have, thirdly, our community online, which has thousands of people show up every week. But then fourth, we said, hey, what if we start trying to start micro churches? And I had coached a lot of church leaders coming out of COVID. I said, hey, if you ever have an idea you wanted to try, now is the time to try it. Because here's the deal. If it doesn't work, guess what? You just blame COVID. COVID. I don't know what to do. COVID. So we decided to give it a shot. And we were thinking we wanted to start a whole bunch of these micro churches across Chicagoland that would be affiliated with us. You tracking with me? And so we provided the training. We provided the training online. And during that first session of training, one of the people that joined us was a guy by the name of Collie. Well, we didn't really anticipate this, but Collie was a part of our communityonline.tv expression, and he lived in India. And he wanted to know, hey, could I go through your microchurch training? And we're like, yeah, I guess, why not? So he goes through our microchurch training, and he ends up planting this small church to reach a particular group of people in India, but still a part of community. And part of me is going like, does that really count? I guess it counts. I guess it's okay. Well, he comes back and he brings 3 more people that he had been discipling. Said, hey, I've been discipling these people. They want to start a church, a microchurch. Can they come? And we're like, okay, they come. The next time around, he says, hey, I got 10 people. I got 10 people. And we just finally said, hey, colleague, why don't you just train them using our stuff? So he trains them. So here's what, we're now 2.5 years into this experiment with microchurches, a new expression. And again, I don't have all the answers to this, but here's what's happened so far. We thought we were going to plant microchurches across Chicago. We now have 121 microchurches. 75 of them are in India. 30 of them are in Uganda. 15 of them are in Cuba. And I think like 7 are in Chicago. But here's the thing. Here's what we're doing. We're launching church expressions. We're looking for new ways of how do we extend the kingdom of God and giving people permission, even when we're not sure about, I don't know, does this really count? One of the guys in my small group is a guy named Rick Boley. Rick's a guy who loves the special needs community. He, probably for the last 10 years, every summer, through an organization called Capernaum that's a part of Young Life, he'll go to a summer camp with all these kids that have special needs, and he's there with them for a week or two, and he just loves it. He comes back to our small group. He talks about it. He cries, tells stories. I mean, he just loves it. So that's Rick. Rick comes to one of our exponential conferences. And at the exponential conference, our closing speaker is a guy named James Meeks. And one of the things we always do in our closing session, we always give people a chance to come forward and make a commitment to plant a church. And if they make that commitment, we actually commission them, just like you saw last night. And we'll even anoint them and pray for them. Say, hey, go get them. We're with you. So it's this closing session. A guy named James Meeks is preaching. And James says this, you don't need to have money to plant a church. You just need to be available. You don't need to have a church building to plant a church. You just need to be available. And he says, you don't need to have a seminary degree. You just need to be available. And my buddy Rick is hearing all this, okay, and he believes it, and he goes like, I'm available. And I see him come forward and make a commitment saying, I want to plant a church. Now, I have no idea what's going on. He comes up to me afterwards and says, hey, Dave, I had an idea. When James was talking about being available, I'm available. Could we start a church that would just be for the special needs community? What if we started a church that was just for families who had members who had special needs? Because you know, Dave, most of them don't come, because when they do come, there's no real place for them, because if that member of their family acts a little awkward, acts a little different, they don't know what to do with them, and everybody kind of stares at them. Could we have it like, and he calls it, could we have an all-abilities church? Could we have an all-abilities church? So Rick goes through our microchurch training. He goes through our 10-week of microchurch training. It was a year and a half ago. He had the first gathering for this, what we thought was going to be a microchurch. He had 120 people show up for that church. And Sue calls it beautiful chaos. It's beautiful chaos because you got all these people there, and I mean, one might have a kid over here who's taking his shirt off in the middle of church, but nobody cares because everybody's used to that kind of stuff going on. And it's this beautiful chaos. And Rick loves it. And here's the thing. I mean, Rick has been in sales for 20 years. It never even occurred to him that he should get paid to pastor that. He is thrilled. I mean, beyond thrilled that we let him do it. And that's what we need to do that. How do we have that kind of missional imagination? Do you see how it works? I mean, it's really kind of simple. I'm not saying it's easy to do. It's hard to do, but it's simple to understand. First of all, you're making disciple makers. Then you're establishing these spiritual communities. And as you establish these spiritual communities, you mobilize these leaders. I see new conversations, send them out. And then you're creatively, continually launch new church expressions. Some are prevailing models, some are traditional models, some are micro, some are macro, some are meta, some are special needs and all abilities churches. You don't care. You're just like, how do we extend the kingdom of God? And see, it's your internal world. We'll go to the next slide. The internal world, that's transformation, your RPMs. So you know you're reproducing who you are, and you're not ending up in a ditch, and you're going to be able to do this for the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years, because this is going to take a long time to pull off. So you got to stay in the game. But in staying in the game, you have the opportunity to do this, and that leads to, go to the next slide, to multiplication. You repeat this over and over again, if the inner leads to transformation, that external flywheel leads to multiplication. And multiplication will eventually get you momentum, and momentum is how you get to movement. We had, I had a guy, I looked at my calendar, and I had an appointment on my calendar with a guy named Sam. And I for the life of me, I couldn't remember why I had this appointment with Sam or even who he was. So I went to my assistant, and I said, hey, it says here I have an appointment with Sam. Who is he, and why am I meeting with him? And my assistant couldn't remember. And I was a little bit aggravated because it's like she has my calendar, she owns my calendar, she mostly sets it up, and I'm hoping she's my memory. And she's like, I don't know, but he's here. He's actually in the cafe. You got to go talk to him. All right. So I go out in the cafe. I stick my hand out. I'm doing the pastor thing, smile on my face. And I'm like, hey, Sam, how you doing? And he says, I'm doing good. And I said, well, I'm making stuff up. Tell me your story. Because I didn't know why we were meeting. So Sam starts telling me his story. Sam was planting churches in India. And he started way back. He said, actually, my dad started the ministry. It was way back in the 60s. And from the 60s to like the mid-90s, we planted about 200 churches. So I was like, wow. Now I'm kind of delighted. Who are you, Sam? This is awesome. I said, well, what happened since then? He said, well, in the mid-90s, actually something pretty significant happened. I was, at that time, I remember I was at my mom and dad's house, and we had a great evening together. My mom went to bed. My dad and I stayed up late that night, kind of chatting and talking well into the evening. And the last thing my dad said before I left the house was, son, whatever you do, don't lose the vision. Don't lose the vision. And he said, I left, and part of the reason I remember that so distinctly is because I left the house, and my dad got very ill that evening. In fact, got so ill that my mom had to take him to the hospital. In fact, when he went to the hospital, he ended up going into a coma. And by the time I got to the hospital, he was not in a state where he could communicate anymore, and he actually passed. And he said that was the last thing my dad ever said to me was, don't lose the vision. Don't lose the vision. So I ended up taking over the ministry. And in taking over the ministry, I kind of began to shift things a little bit. I just insisted that all of our church planters would have somebody that they were discipling who would plant another church every year. Does that make sense? So I would disciple every church planter we had. They not only would lead their church, but they'd also take alongside them someone they were discipling that would plant a church the next year. And so they would do it. They would lead a church, and then they would disciple them, and they'd plant a church. He said, but one of the tests that I had for them is they needed to actually just start a small group. As they were apprenticing with me, as I'm discipling, one of the things they had to do is start a small group. And at the end of that year, I would tell everyone, church planter, we would disciple them, and part of the test was start a small group. At the end of that year, then we would commission you, we'd send you out, and then you'd go start a brand new church, and we'd start that process all over again the next year. You tracking with me? So he began to explain this to me. I was so fascinated by the process. I said, so Sam, how's it going now? And he said, it's going pretty good. I said, well, like how good? He said, well, so far we've planted over 70,000 churches. And I don't know what happened if my face was just stunned, because I don't think he thought I was impressed, because then he said, but we're praying for 100,000 churches. And his name's Sam, I found out later, his name's Sam Stevens. Sam's the president of the India Gospel League, and since that time, they've now planted more than 100,000 churches. But I want you to think about his story, right? He made a small tweak. Let's go back to how to make disciple makers, right? Every year, each pastor, had someone that they were a disciple who's going to plant a church. Part of the test was that they would lead a small group and start a small group. Then they would mobilize those leaders. Those leaders, after a year, they didn't stay as their assistant pastor, as their associate pastor, right? No. They mobilize those leaders, they commission, they send them out. And what they send them out to do? To launch, help me out, what? A new church expression. And they just did that over and over again. I mean, it's the flywheel, isn't it? That's what it is. I mean, and they began to crank that flywheel, and pretty soon, you know what? We went past 70,000, 100,000 brand new churches, and this is how you get there. And that's how you do it. And I was like, wow. So again, let's go back, and I don't know if we'll have time for Q&A. You can tell me, Rob. What's your dream? What's your dream? I feel like part of my job, and part of the reason I'm here all the way from Chicago, is I think maybe, and I hope I'm not too presumptuous about this. I think God's kind of given me a gift for taking challenging and hard things and explaining them simply. So what I want to do is I want to remove the I don't know how to do that. You know how to do it. Okay? It is that simple. It's also that hard. It is that simple, but it's also that hard. And if that is the dream, if that's the thing that God's called you to, I'm telling you, I would love, wish I had the opportunity to sit across from everyone and have a cup of tea and just talk. I'm telling you, you can do this. You can do this. You can do this. All right? All right, thanks. 10 minutes? All right. I think we got a little bit of time for Q&A. I think Anna and Matt are going to help us out here. So if there's anything, any questions you have, anything we've talked about in the last couple of days, would love to pick up on that, or anything else you want to talk about, candidly. Just so I guess raise your hand, and Matt and Anna will find you. Here we go. And we'll do that for about 10 minutes.
I guess I was just thinking about the difference between the Indian church and the church here. And, I mean, they're proselytizing into a community that's completely anti, and I would have thought. So is there anything that we've learnt from what's happening in India that would be really helpful to us?
The question, yeah, I think there are definitely things that we learn. One is, I think, and I'll say this in a way, because I think the States and Australia, we're enough the same. We have a mental paradigm about church that's this. When I say church, you think this. When they don't have that mental paradigm, both, quite frankly, and this is also to their advantage, both church folks or unchurched folks. And so I think that is a significant advantage to them. I think the other significant advantage is them. It's probably definitely compared to the U.S. My hunch is compared to Australia. It's a much more communal society too. So if one person who's kind of in authority or in leadership kind of buys into it, the whole gang comes with them. I saw this also in Africa. So I do think those things are advantages. When I was in Africa too, the other thing that was remarkable about Africa too is it's such a young continent. I mean, the average age in Africa is 18. In Uganda, where I was, the median age rather, is 16. And then on top of that, they have great sound biblical teaching that reminds us that the disciples were probably teenagers, with the exception of Peter, maybe. So you got Jesus, who's 30, who's the old rabbi. You got Peter, who's in early 20s, and the rest are teenagers. And so they're teaching that to a continent, okay, whose average age is 18, and that's another significant, because there's a lot of young people that who are doing exactly what we're talking about here, launching church expressions and leading. So I think the fundamentals are exactly the same, because I think the fundamentals are scriptural. We see it in the early church. But I do think there's some contextual advantages they have over us. But I think we just have to overcome them. We have to overcome them. Yeah. Anybody else? All right. Yeah, there's one back there. Go ahead. If you do have a question, go ahead and raise your hand, and Matt will find you. We can keep it moving. If we don't have to, though. Go ahead.
How you doing? Thanks so much for sharing today. I just wonder if you could speak into what I presume is underneath all of this, around how much prayer you put into church planning and some of that stuff. Because I love the model, I love the idea and the energy, but I'm conscious that in our own strength, that sustainability isn't always there. But I'd love to hear what you think about that.
I think two thoughts. I think the question is around prayer and what does prayer do to support all this. One is I think you're 100% right, because I think you're probably making more of a statement than a question, which is fine, 100% fine. And part of the reason I say that is because I don't really think I'm that great at that part. In fact, but I do think you're absolutely right. And it's interesting, like at Exponential in the U.S., which I lead, we actually are constantly teaching church planners and encouraging church planting, encouraging multiplication, doing this whole thing. We have what we call 9 different frameworks. The last framework that we added was the framework of prayer and fasting. And we got to that place, and I think it's partly the way I'm wired. I'm like wired for action. And so it doesn't come naturally. But as we got to that place where the last framework was around prayer and fasting, the Holy Spirit, I think I confessed, and all of us admitted, like, oh my gosh, this one should have been first. This one should have been first. So, I mean, I guess I don't know if it was I felt like it was kind of an observation you were making. I don't think it's really as true of me as maybe you're being nice to say. But I do think that's what should happen. And there's some things that have happened through Exponential, I would say, over the last 3 years that are unprecedented. And there's some things that are happening that are unexplainable by, like, good old-fashioned Dave Ferguson hard work. That I think are only happening because we're leaning into prayer, fasting, and the work of the Holy Spirit different than we ever have before. So, I mean, and maybe some of the things we talk about that are even cultural challenges that we have, the way that we're going to overcome those, and kind of maybe the way God gives us guidance and wisdom that's going to come through prayer, fasting, and the Holy Spirit. So, my suggestion, Rob, is next year you get somebody who's not so great on strategies and tactics, but we get someone who talks about prayer, fasting, and the Holy Spirit. Because if you put those two things together, then you got something special. So, thank you for that. Anybody else? All right. I think we've done it. I think all good. Hey, again, I want to say thank you very, very much. Thanks for allowing Sue and I to be here, to be with you, and be part of the family over the last couple days. Super encouraged. Love Rob's report. 500 baptisms. 17 brand new people more than ever that are ordained. Let's keep moving, keep advancing the kingdom. And thank you very much. All right, see you.